And I fell in with a friend of mine in school. And he actually bought a copy of this magazine called Astounding. And I got to read a couple stories, and I said, hey, that was really interesting. So I went up to the drugstore, and I bought a copy, and I read it cover to cover. And then I said, this is pretty good. And there was a bookstore in Baltimore called Mr. Coleman's College, where they used to sell magazines that had the covers ripped off, which I thought was a great place. And they had a section in there about this wide, it went all the way up to the ceiling, and it had these books just crammed in there like this. And they had Amazings and Galaxy and Astounding and several others in there. And they were 10 cents a piece. And I would take my money that I'd gotten from our shared lawn cutting business. Another friend of myself got $1.50 doing a lawn. So I had 75 cents. So I would pay for the bus fare to get up to Baltimore, which was 50 cents round trip. And then with the leftover money, I would buy as many of these things as I could carry, and then I would go home and I would read them, and the next week I'd do. Well, I was reading copies from 1934, 35, 38, 42, etc. on this, not realizing. And then I got very lucky and had a fortunate. I acquired almost $5. So I went up to Baltimore and bought my first science fiction book, which was Pebble in the Sky, because it was on sale for $1.50. And at that point, I was really seriously hooked, and I started subscribing to Astounding, and I've kept that subscription up for 65 years. 65 years. Yeah. And one of the proudest moments I had was actually selling a story and seeing it appear in the magazine. I mean, it's one thing to sell it. It's another thing to get the physical copy in your hand and see your name right there and buy it. I sold 2 stories, and then I had to finish graduate school and get out of the Air Force and send the kids to college and do a whole bunch of other crap. And then in 91, 92, I started writing again. And I wrote a story, and I said to the analog, I said, Stan sent me a letter back, and he says, I'm glad to see you're writing again. He said, I really enjoyed it, and he referred to one of the first stories I'd written. And I thought, he's got a pretty good Harley problem in there. And I couldn't wait. And they said, the copy's coming out, the copy's coming out. And the copy came out, and I opened it up. And it was Dad by Jeff Koistra. I thought, you gotta be kidding me. So I sent Stan a letter and saying, what the hell are you doing? I had 13 years I've been waiting to sell the 3rd story, and you got the wrong name on it. Well, Jeff and I became very good friends as a result.
Well, it was entirely my fault.
Yeah.
Me. Not Stan, not anyone else in the magazine.
Well,
that one was mine.
I wasn't going to mention it.
Oh, what the hell. I don't care anymore. The problem was, in the issue before was a story called Love Dad by Jeff Koistra. So when I was proofreading the table of contents the last time through, I said, whoops, we got the wrong name there, and I just corrected it. And since it was so late, there was no chance for anybody to check my work. I'm sorry.
You were not alone in copy editing problems.
Yeah, but that one I remember making, that one specifically. Anyway, I'm sorry, I interrupted your story. Keep going.
Anyway, so I got this Pebble in the Sky, and I read it. It was by a guy named Eisenhower. So I went back to the bookstore, and I went through all the things, and I found everything that had an Eisenhower story and pulled it off. And that's how I discovered the Foundation series. And I actually got to read them in the original magazine, parts of them in the original magazine. So it's kind of interesting when you look through the history of Astounding and Analog, how little things have changed over the long period. Yeah, the writing's getting a lot better. There's a lot more literary influence in the magazine than there was at one time. And under Trevor Clarkey, the magazine's getting a little further away from hard science stories and more into philosophical stories. Because the traditional analog story has basically got the gadget at the heart and an engineer with the problem. You know, it's never about scientists, it's always about engineers. If you take a look at the stories,
I think it's interesting you say that because, I mean, I started reading analog late, long after I read Astounding and stuff like that, and then went back and read all the old issues. And I think Analog is an Astounding. It had been known as the hard science fiction magazine, but if you go back and look, some of what turned out to be, I call them, gems, these things that you don't hear a lot about, but you kind of find by going back and reading them. Some of those are not at all. And what's interesting is reading the letter columns in conjunction with them. So, for instance, in May 1939, Lester Del Rey published a story called "The Day Is Done." And the letter columns that follow that story were like, well, this isn't a science fiction story. So if you guys don't know about "The Day Is Done," it's basically about the very last Neanderthal and how he's sort of dying off, and the Homo sapiens are sort of surviving and taking over the world and stuff. And it's sort of this sad story. But there's no rocket ships, there's no aliens, there's no gadgets, there's no anything. It was a fantastic story. A year or so later, L. Ron Hubbard, pre-Dianetics days, had a serial, Final Blackout, which was another great, it was this great story, but it was, until the very end, when the Americans come to Europe, there was no gadgets. It was just this lieutenant. It was sort of like Saving Private Ryan in a way. It was this nameless lieutenant in this troop, kind of wandering around devastated Europe. Not at all what you'd think of as science fiction, but more this experimental kind of thing. And there's bits and pieces of that throughout those early Golden Age years, which whenever people say, "Oh, I've never," it's hard science. It's not. I kind of think about those stories and how many more are embedded in there that people just don't know about because, Campbell did have an eye for that stuff. He was known for the gadgets and the engineering and stuff, but every once in a while, one of those stories would pop up and kind of surprise him. And it was interesting to see those. It was even more interesting, I thought, to read the letter columns. Everybody knows sort of the controversies that go on today and the flame wars and all that. I remember reading, when I was going back and reading these, a letter column. This would have been somewhere in the after July 1939, but before 1940. A lot of letter columns were complaining about the artists, and one of them was vitriolic, even compared to what we do on the internet today. And it was going on, and just like, this person should be shot, this person should never be allowed to pick up a pen again, blah, 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 blah. Sign, 15-year-old Damon Knight. And so, you sort of see that too. You see the fans evolving through it. Damon Knight's a fan, then he becomes a writer. You see Ray Bradbury writing letters, you see Isaac Asimov writing letters, you see Nelson X. Bond writing letters, and all these guys. And so it was sort of this interesting. It made it much more like, wow, I can do this too. I could eventually. So that day when my son, at the time my 2-year-old son was sick. This was in 2010, and checking email, and he's downstairs sitting on my lap, and I see an email message that said Stan Schmidt, and it said, the first line said, "Jamie, I'm taking this story." I jump up in the air and scream, and my son bursts into tears. Well, I'm trying to explain to him, you don't understand. This magazine's been around forever, and I finally made it. It's interesting to see it from that perspective.
If any of you have a chance to go back and look at some of those 1940s, early 1950s period, there was an artist in there who I always admired, Cartier, in there, who drew these exquisite soft line drawings. They were just beautiful. He illustrated the Hand in Pain, Straight McCann stories, but they're just lovely. You just don't see that quality of art in the magazine today.
See, I have a first sale story too, but mine is probably unlike any other writer in Analog's history, because I was working at the magazine.
And batting in.
Yeah, I did. When I went in for my second interview, I met the editors, Gardner and Asimov and Stan at Analog, and both of them said, "I have a story from you on my desk." I I wanted them to realize I was a writer too. I hadn't sold anything yet. Neither one of them bought either of those stories, but I was there, well, let's see, I was there almost 2.5 years before I got a nibble. And it was one day Stan came into the office on a Tuesday, because he came in on Tuesdays, and he asked me about the story I'd given him. He said, tell me, was Pierre de Fermat really married real life? I said, geez, I don't know. He said, well, this is analog. So on my lunch break, I walked the 3 blocks from the office to the main New York Public Library, found a biography of Fermat, dug it out, realized that indeed he was married, photocopied the page, brought it back to the office after lunch, and said, here, look, Fermat really was married. And Stan said, well then I guess I'm going to buy your story. And I hugged him.
Schmidt was an absolute devil in scientific accuracy and detail. I wrote a story about taking